As Belle Noonan had made her way along Red Lion Street towards the police station, several of the night-turn constables were already emerging out, into the dawn. Cursing beneath her breath, she ignored their mocking catcalls and whistles, instead hurrying onwards, in through the thick wooden doors of the front office. WPC Belinda Nunan had been no stranger to the disapproval and sanction of her colleagues during the short time she had served with the Wolverhampton Borough Police. The majority of the male officers not seeming to share the government's view that it had been necessary to employ women as police constables following the outbreak of war. She had tried hard not to provide further reason for them to belittle her, standing up to their abuse with the same fierce nature shown to the various criminals she had encountered. But with her vivid red hair, betraying the heritage of a large Irish family, it seemed there would never be enough she could do to earn their trust or support. Electing not to disclose the lack of sleep that had been caused by a sick younger brother during the previous evening, she had instead simply apologised to the desk sergeant, humbly enduring the lecture he had delivered on how punctuality was the most important quality in policing, and how in wartime it was essential to maintain high standards. And it was as she had been on the verge of descending the stairs to the locker room that a familiar voice had called out for her to stop and turn around, her heart racing just as fast as her head, as she tried to piece together the reasons why the head of the borough's CID department would be on duty at such an early hour, or why he would be asking for her by name. The detective inspector whose office she had been requested to enter was almost universally respected by the officers who worked alongside him within the city centre district. A former war veteran, he held a proven track record for capturing and convicting the more problematic inhabitants that resided in and around Wolverhampton. Members of notorious families such as the Birds and the Anslows, miscreants whose fathers and uncles had never returned home from their service on the battlefields of France. The absence of those older relatives, not only depriving the next generation of their families from financial support, but also the faintest hope they had ever had of moral guidance. He was a firm leader, never leaving any of his staff in any doubt of what he expected from them, whilst being utterly accommodating and supportive in their times of need. And yet, even 2 decades on, the bizarre rumours behind why he had transferred across to this borough from the neighbouring Dudley Force still persisted, with officers who had worked there maintaining he'd returned from the Great War with some form of mental illness, and it was likely only a matter of time before that resurfaced. As she stood now in his office, it was clear from the look in Inspector Armitage's eyes that the young female officer had failed to mask the deep apprehension she was feeling. Waving for her to take a seat, he'd smiled in an effort to reassure the constable, while she settled down into a chair alongside the room's only other occupant, a uniformed RAF officer who appeared to be not much older than herself, an equally unsettled expression etched across his youthful features. In short order, he was introduced to her by the inspector as Flight Officer Ryan, a member of the senior staff at the RAF Base at neighbouring Cosford. The flying officer had been ordered to attend the police station at the behest of the base medical officer, Dr. Owens. The precise reasons for their attendance would be made clear to her the following morning, when she would meet the inspector back at the station in order for him to drive across to the base. As for the duration of this inquiry, she would now be seconded to the city's CID department, spending the remainder of today sourcing herself some suitable clothing in which to work. When Amos Armitage had first arrived at Red Lion Street, the lasting damage caused to his leg during the dying days of the Great War had been obvious to all. Indeed, one of the more ugly and outlandish tales that had circulated about him at the time was that the inspector had really sustained the injury during his time working in Dudley, with rumour-mongers swearing they had heard testimony that the then sergeant had been detained by his colleagues whilst drunk, raving about demons disguised as human beings. But as Noonan watched him walk towards her, the inspector's limp was now almost imperceptible, only the occasional wince of discomfort belying the existence of the old injury. Minutes later, the unmarked Wolseley she was driving was passing the leafy open space of the city's technical district, with neither Noonan nor a superior yet to have spoken. Instead, Armitage sat staring out of the passenger window, apparently taking in the mist that was burning up and rolling off the fields that they passed, en route to the airbase. By the midway point of the journey, it was Nunan that had finally broken the silence, thanking the inspector for granting her this opportunity, but expressing her curiosity as to why. With a warm smile, he'd slowly turned around to face her, explaining that when he'd first arrived in the borough, he had very much been viewed as an outsider. It was a status that in some ways he'd enjoyed more than the one which he now held, and in her, he recognised the same spirit and determination he had felt back then. The task he'd agreed to undertake was grisly in nature, but was also unconventional. What he required was someone distinctly set apart from the general culture of the station, someone more likely to be able to speak freely when alongside him, but less likely to speak as freely when they returned back to the station and their peers. Emboldened by the frank and open honesty of Armitage's words, she again thanked him, promising she'd perform her duties to a high standard and in complete confidence. With a warm nod, the inspector then momentarily turned away again to resume his view out of the window, before clearing his throat for a moment or two later to inquire if Nunan had ever before seen a dead body. From the moment she set foot inside the mortuary, Nunan had been frantically fighting the overwhelming urge to vomit, a battle she knew she may ultimately not win. The smell alone had been upsetting enough, and an easy mixture of cold metal, harsh cleaning fluids, and remorseless decay of the poor souls that lay within this place. But it was the sight she beheld, when the doctor pulled back the blanket which was draped over the trolley before them, that had finally decided the matter. The horrifying vision of the dead man that was now on display, a look of pure shock and horror etched upon his features, eyes stretched wide open at the exact point he had expired. The thick and cold sections of the highly polished metal wire fence that jutted out from his skull, also protruding from the sides of his naked body, indicating how he'd met his end. When she returned to the room several minutes later, the doctor had offered a handkerchief, before smiling politely at her subsequent refusal to be excused from the procedure, kindly explaining how it had been many years since he'd had to undertake such an operation, and he was feeling just as intimidated by proceedings as she was. Then at the inspector's behest she had started to take notes on her jotter, about how the man had been found hanging on the perimeter fence in the early hours of the morning, with no indication of how his remains had come to be integrated amidst the wiring of the fence, without leaving any other form of entry wound to the rest of his exterior. How no clothing or personal effects had been found as a means of identifying him, and how he was the only one of several such bodies found in the vicinity of the base in recent months. One body, lying broken and shattered at the end of the station's runway, as if it had fallen from a great height. Another, recovered from the depths of the local canal, also both naked. She continued to take notes as the examination progressed, with an airman taking photographs alongside her, at the direction of a distinctly uncomfortable flying officer Ryan. There had been a short delay, whilst the photographs were developed. The offer of a lunch in the officers' mess politely declined, with coffee and sandwiches served instead. And then, when the photographs had been returned, along with copies of those from the previous two postmortems, the two police officers bid the doctor farewell. The inspector's parting handshake, accompanied by a promise he would unearth the true reasoning behind what had taken place, and prevent any further, unnecessary deaths. That evening, with the rest of the CID department having retired to their favourite drinking hole, Armitage and Nunan secured themselves in the briefing room, with the inspector sourcing further cups of coffee, whilst Nunan pinned the various autopsy photographs onto a board that ran along the side of one wall. Upon his return, Armitage had asked for observations on the matter, the request striking the young female officer as perhaps a veiled assessment of her capabilities. She had replied how in the first two cases, it was likely the men had died as a result of falling from a great height, such as an aeroplane or a parachute. This was not true of the third case, for which she believed the fence's apparent recent construction to be a causal factor in how the dead man had come to rest in it. Smiling approvingly, his superior gestured for her to continue sharing her thoughts, listening intently as she resumed her commentary. Nunan observed the deceased all appeared to bear the hallmarks of some form of military service, be this in uniform or a more clandestine agency. All were aged roughly the same, in their 20s or 30s, clean-shaven, with matching cropped haircuts, no sign of any tattoo or significant mark or scar upon their bodies, which led her to believe they represented the same agency or nation and had all been transported to the site by the same means, dying as a result of the same unknown issue. Setting aside his mug, Armitage had nodded in approval, sharing two hypotheses. Either these men were subject to a military operation that nobody at the base was party to, or they were members of an unknown agency, dispatched on a secret mission, whose goals were not yet fully clear. In which case, as was likely in the spycraft trade, there may be further evidence secreted deeper within their bodies, perhaps missed by the doctor during his cursory inspection. Having asked Nunan to cover over the notice board with a sheet, and ensured the room was locked and secured when she'd done so, Armitage bade her good night, explaining that on commencing their duties the following morning, he would call the airbase and arrange a more in-depth examination of the 3 dead bodies. From her previous experience of medical practitioners, Nunan had been concerned that Dr. Owens may be somewhat put out at being requested to repeat his work. But upon their arrival at the mortuary, she found the doctor in high spirits, apparently as eager as the inspector to unearth any clue as to how to proceed with their investigation. Watching the two men interact, she found she struggled to find much commonality between them, one being a war veteran, the other a career caregiver. In comparison, Flying Officer Ryan seemed to want to limit his involvement in the whole affair as much as possible, exchanging little in the way of pleasantries, arriving and departing at the exact time he was required, no more, no less, with a certain degree of tension evident when he was ordered to do something by Dr. Owens. It was Armitage who unearthed the clue they were searching for, leaning in over the doctor as they examined the first of the bodies, focusing on the cadaver's right forearm. There, he stated, was evidence of what potentially could be a medical procedure, with a small patch of skin which seemed rougher and more elevated than that which surrounded it. Having more closely inspected the affected area, Owens soon found himself in agreement, likening the skin there to having been recently tattooed. It was at this point that Armitage had turned to make a request of Ryan, smiling slightly as the younger man had hurried from the room, having now been provided with an excuse to do so. As they awaited the junior officer's return, the inspection continued. An identical area of roughened skin confirmed to be present on the right forearms of all 3 men. In addition to this, an abnormality was then discovered in the left wrist of the body that had been found trapped on the base's fencing, with what appeared to be exceptionally fine wiring or fibres, visible at one point where the metal of the fencing entered the skin. Cutting down into the wrist with his scalpel, the doctor's brow furrowed as he caught sight of what appeared to be a series of thin cables just beneath the skin's surface. Nunan watched on as the speed of his movements gradually increased, his cuts exposing still more of this mysterious cabling, hidden within the dead man's appendage. Slowly but surely, a larger mass was exposed, secreted under the palm of the cadaver's left hand, with the wires emanating from it right up to the length of the attached limb. The discovery disrupted only by the return of Ryan, carrying the items he had been requested by Inspector Armitage, his eyes widening as fast as the fluids that travelled up through his throat out onto the floor, as he unexpectedly caught sight of the exposed insides of the dead man's arm. Without being asked to do so, the airman who had been stood ready to take further photographs if required silently stepped forward to assist with cleaning the floor, the flying officer making his excuses and leaving the room to tend to his vomit-stained uniform, whilst the procedure to remove the device from the dead man's hand continued. Once complete, it was then photographed from various angles, before being placed into a secure box and removed to the base's main armoury for safekeeping. It was at this stage in proceedings that Armitage had stepped forwards and begun to make use of the materials secured by the hapless junior officer, first applying lemon juice to the rough patch of skin on the body's right forearm, then utilising iodine when there was no obvious chemical reaction. When this substance also failed to elicit a response, the detective then reached for the portable UV lamp, with which he'd been provided. A warm smile spreading across his face when it was illuminated, and a harsh white glow was seen to emit from the area of exposed flesh in question. Waving the photographer forwards, Armitage directed that a detailed series of images as possible be captured, before asking for the other bodies to be brought forwards. It was soon confirmed the remaining corpses also held identical devices, hidden in the palms of their left hands and wrists, with concealed messages marked upon their right arms. The remainder of the autopsy not finding anything else of note about how the three men, beyond the oddities which had already now been unearthed. A further 2 hours would pass, with the doctor and the policeman engaged in deep conversation, before the photographs had been developed and enlarged as far as possible. Then the inspector again bade his opposite number a warm farewell, and asked Nunan to take him back to the police station for what would prove to be a long evening. Although initially surprised at her supervisor's order to stop off at a rural inn on their way back to the station, the young detective found herself grateful for the decision, hungrily tucking away a large portion of meat and potatoes which the publican had provided, apparently as a result of some discreet service the inspector had rendered him in the past. She found that conversation flowed easily between the two of them, with Armitage smiling warmly as she shared tales with him of her large and dysfunctional family. It was only when she'd asked about his prior service in the Dudley Borough, his features had darkened slightly, before he fixed her with a serious look, informing her that what he had experienced there had been no less unnatural and bizarre than the case which they were now investigating, and that if she were concerned about her reputation, rather than pursuing the matter to whatever conclusion awaited them, perhaps he'd been hasty in selecting her to assist him. She'd hardly registered her hand taking hold of his, as she'd sworn that that was not the case, the two acknowledging the act at the same time, both clumsily withdrawing away from it. Then over dinner, he told her the tale of the young man who'd pursued and dispatched a monster that had killed his best friend, and spent the rest of his days in jail as a result of this act. Despite her assurances she believed the tale to be true, the remainder of the journey back to the station was awkward for the two officers, both keen to sequester themselves once again in the briefing room after its occupants had exited for their nightly debrief at a nearby city centre drinking establishment. The deep conversations from the inn table only hours before were now not spoken of, as the inspector stared intently at the messages the UV light had exposed from the men's forearms. For the next few hours, Armitage noted down the two distinct sets of digits which had been discreetly tattooed onto the bodies of the dead men, occasionally rearranging them, only to put them back in order, sometimes groaning in frustration when whatever he'd attempted had failed. Finally, as dawn's light began to materialise from the windows in the corridor outside, a shout of triumph sounded from within the room, the night shift officers on duty there drawing a somewhat inevitable conclusion, as the detective inspector and a young female constable came running from the room, disappearing out of the station at speed, clearly consumed by a sense of elation and triumph. 3 weeks later, as the midnight hour slowly made its way around the clock face towards them, the detectives found themselves stood out in the middle of a field. They were not alone, with the senior staff of the nearby airbase also in attendance, along with the security detail of RAF Regiment guards. Off to their side, Owens was also standing nearby, with several other men alongside him, whose identity had not been made fully clear to the two police officers. Through trial and error, Nunan had finally managed to work out that one set of the figures, etched into the arms of the corpses, represented a time and date, the appointed hour always having been in the rough time frame the body had gone on to be located by the authorities. At almost the exact same time she'd done this, Armitage had triumphed in a similar manner, discerning the second set of figures to be the map coordinates for the exact point where the bodies had been found. Utilising those found on the third body, the one that had seemingly materialised in the centre of their perimeter fence, they had now assembled at this lonely and remote point, waiting to see if the mystery of the three dead men could now be explained by the evidence they bore upon their remains. Despite wearing a heaviest jacket, Nunan was still visibly struggling to combat the falling temperatures, her initial refusal of Armitage's overcoat firmly dismissed, as he draped the far heavier garment he wore around her shoulders. the lingering of his hands as he deposited the item not going unnoticed, indicative of the growing bond between the pair. All at once, the low murmur of conversation that had been passing amongst those assembled began to peter out, as the distinct hum became audible throughout the night air, this unnatural sound rising to a significant point, and then suddenly terminating, at the same time as all present detected a brief tremor from the ground underneath their feet. For a few moments, silence reigned, followed by a couple of nervous whispers commencing between the various assembled parties. Then there was a sudden cry, as the realisation of what must have taken place suddenly dawned upon Dr. Owens, the old practitioner shouting for shovels and digging equipment to be brought from the vehicles they'd ridden from the base, as quickly as possible. Armitage simultaneously falling to the ground, tearing at it with his hands as he too suddenly realised the significance of the distinct tremor they had all felt beneath their feet. It had taken significant time to locate the fourth corpse, and even more so in order to delicately remove it from the ground as soon as it had been located. Nobody had spoken, as the cold and lifeless body was removed to the mortuary, Armitage electing not even to attend the postmortem on this occasion. He'd remained in his office for the majority of the next day, neither Nunan nor any other officer able to find a reason to successfully coax him forth. Clearly frustrated and angry, he'd not anticipated the fact there could be issues with the arrival of this fourth mysterious corpse, which potentially could have been catered for. Over the coming months, as designated by the new date and coordinates recovered from the fourth arrival, the inspector's mood would eventually soften, the matter being shelved for a time at the expense of the department's daily business, Nunan herself slowly becoming accepted by her new CID colleagues. And then with Easter approaching, the two detectives again found themselves drawn back to the airbase, where this time precautions had been taken for the expected arrival of a fourth unknown intruder. An area of ground cleared away and lowered, and netting strung up in the event that a body may come plummeting again from the skies above. The group found itself standing waiting, silently in anticipation as the appointed hour arrived, bracing itself as a familiar hum once again commenced. On this occasion, the termination of the unnatural sound coincided with a brief flash of purplish light above the ground ahead of them. A fully naked man, with a familiar profile and appearance suddenly materialising in thin air, as if from nowhere, falling heavily to the ground, and lying completely immobile as RAF guards advanced towards him, their weapons levelled. A brief inspection from Owens confirmed this time the new arrival was both conscious and breathing. A medical inspection followed, before the newcomer was wrapped in a blanket, handcuffed, and removed to the station barracks. For the next few hours, Nunan and Armitage remained seated alone in the adjoining mess hall, quietly discussing what they believed had taken place, until Ryan came and asked them to accompany him, the prisoner having apparently asked for Inspector Armitage by name, refusing to speak with any other man. Having been ushered into a cramped interview room, Amos Armitage stared with curiosity at the man seated before him, who displayed neither fear nor intimidation, asking for the inspector to confirm his identity before he spoke, explaining how he was a member of His Majesty's Armed Forces, but from another place and another time, and how it was vital that Armitage helped him to persuade the military, here and now, to assist him in his mission, to save Adolf Hitler from assassination.